You've probably heard some famous lines from the New Testament 1,000 times. But what if I told you we might have been reading them through the wrong lens for almost 1,700 years? Today, we're going to hit the rewind button, go back past all those centuries of Greek philosophy, and try to hear these words the way their very first Jewish audience would have. And trust me, the difference is, well, it's staggering.
Let's just dive right in with a huge moment. The Apostle Thomas, face to face with the resurrected Jesus, blurts out, "My Lord and my God." Now, for a lot of people, that's it. Case closed. The ultimate proof that Jesus is the one, supreme God. But is that really what Thomas, a first-century Jew, was getting at?
So the standard reading, right, is that Thomas is having this sudden revelation. He's identifying Jesus as Almighty God himself. But what if his entire Jewish worldview gave him a totally different way to understand what he was seeing? What if he was making a claim that was just as mind-blowing, but different?
To get to the bottom of this, we have to avoid a really common trap called anachronism. It's basically where we accidentally slap our own modern ideas and categories onto an ancient world that just didn't think that way. To really hear what the apostles were saying, we have to try, as best we can, to see the world through their eyes.
And this brings us to two completely different ways of reading the Bible. You have the later Greek philosophical lens from church councils like Nicaea in the 4th century. They were obsessed with ontology, asking, what is Jesus' essential substance? What is he made of? But the original Jewish authors, they were focused on agency. They were asking, what is Jesus' function? What is his authorized mission? See the difference?
So, what was in the mental toolkit of a first-century reader? I mean, to get why they reached certain conclusions, we've got to understand their starting points. And it really all boils down to two huge ideas that were just in the air back then.
First up, we've got to talk about the concept of the logos, or the word. And our best guide here is an amazing Jewish philosopher named Philo, who was actually alive at the same time as Jesus and the apostles. He talked about the logos as God's divine agent, sort of like a firstborn son who acts as a go-between. This logos was absolutely divine in its character, but it was still distinct from and subordinate to the one supreme God.
And listen to how Philo puts it here. He says the Logos is neither uncreated as God, nor yet created as you. He saw this figure as this unique divine bridge between the ultimate God and the rest of humanity. And this wasn't some weird fringe idea. This was a central concept in the intellectual world of the apostles.
Okay, key concept number 2 is a legal principle that was baked right into Jewish law and culture, the shaliach. A shaliach is basically an authorized agent or an emissary, and the core idea is simple but powerful. A person's agent is regarded as the person himself. For the purposes of the mission, the agent is the one who sent them.
A perfect modern analogy is an ambassador. They walk into a room and speak with the full, complete authority of the president or the king who sent them. To honor that ambassador is to honor the king. To insult them, well, you're insulting the king. The agent carries all the authority of the sender, even though they are obviously not the same person.
Okay, so, armed with these two ideas, Philo's concept of the logos and the Jewish principle of the shaliach, let's go back to those famous verses from the Gospel of John and see what happens when we put on our first-century glasses.
Let's start with the big one, John 1:1. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, through that later Greek lens, this sounds like they're one and the same substance. But with an agency lens, a really important nuance in the original Greek just pops. The text makes a subtle distinction between the word being divine in quality, the Greek word is theos, and being with the God, ho theos. It separates the agent from the ultimate source, just like Philo did.
Later on, when Jesus gets accused of blasphemy for making himself God, his defense is absolutely fascinating. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't start talking about his divine substance. No, he makes a classic agency argument. He basically says, hey, your own scriptures call human judges gods because they're acting as God's agents. So if they get that title, why is it blasphemy for me, the one the Father personally consecrated and sent into the world to be called God's Son? His whole defense is built on his identity as a sent agent.
Which brings us right back to Thomas. Is he suddenly making a complex metaphysical statement about Jesus' ontology? Or is he finally getting it? Is he looking at the resurrected Jesus and realizing that he is standing in the presence of the perfect agent, the one who carries the full authority and presence of the God who sent him? This wasn't some new radical idea. Thomas was plugging into a pattern he knew from his own scriptures.
I mean, just think about the Old Testament. To meet God's authorized agent, like the famous angel of the Lord, was, for all practical purposes, to meet God.
Jacob wrestles with an angel and says, "I have seen God face to face." Manoah, Samson's father, sees an angel and panics, saying, "We have seen God." In their worldview, the agent so perfectly embodied the sender that there was no distinction in the encounter. Thomas isn't inventing something new here. He's just placing Jesus at the absolute pinnacle of this ancient tradition. He is the ultimate agent of God.
So, okay, we've got these two models, these two lenses. The later Greek one focused on substance and the earlier Jewish one focused on agency. And you might be asking, all right, so what? Why does this really matter? Well, it turns out the lens you choose has massive consequences down the line.
What happened over those first few centuries was a huge pivot. It was a shift away from the classic Hebraic questions of function and mission, who does what, to a very Greek philosophical question of essence and being. What is he? And when you change the fundamental question you're asking, you're bound to get a different answer. This chart, drawn from our source material, really lays out the different outcomes. The argument goes like this. The agency model is rooted directly in the language and concepts you actually find in the Bible. It's logically consistent. The later Nicene model, on the other hand, had to bring in philosophical concepts from outside the Bible, which created some logical puzzles and used language that just isn't explicitly there in the text. And one of the biggest consequences of this shift had to do with talking to other monotheists. This new language of co-equal persons sharing one divine substance became a major barrier, a real stumbling block. For other groups who held to a very strict absolute oneness of God, like Jews and later Muslims, this new formulation sounded like it was compromising that oneness, which made the message a lot harder to hear.
Now, it's really important to get this straight. The point of exploring this agency model isn't to diminish Jesus, not at all. In fact, you could say it's the opposite. It's about trying to recover the original context so we can hear just how radical a claim the apostles were actually making, that Jesus was God's supreme agent, the perfect word brought to life. They were just doing it using the concepts and the language of their world, not ours.
And all of this leaves us with one last massive question. If the world of the apostles was so filled with these powerful ideas of agency, the logos, and the shilaliach, what on earth happened? What historical, cultural, or political forces were powerful enough to make the church shift its entire foundational language from the Jewish world of function and mission to the Greek world of essence and ontology? Now that is a story for another day.